What in the world? So Jefferson was born on April 13, 1753, in Virginia. His father was a planter, and he was related to a powerful Virginia family, the Randolphs, through his mom's side. And he even attended school and lived with some of his Randolph cousins for a time. So he attended schools beginning at age 5. His father had never been to school and wanted Jefferson to go to school. And in school, he studied mathematics, he studied Latin, Greek, French. He learned to ride horses, kind of the scholarly pursuits of a young gentleman planter of his day. He entered college at the age of 16. He went to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. This is a picture of the college building where he would have stayed and studied at the time. He continued his studies of Greek and French. He knew how to play the violin and continued to practice that at college. He studied math, philosophy, science, and he graduated 2 years later. He studied law under a guy named George Wythe, who was a professor there at the College of William and Mary, and obtained his law license while studying with George Wythe. George Wythe was so impressed with him as a student, as an intellectual, that when Wythe died, he left his entire library to Jefferson, who was a book lover his entire life as well. So you'll see one theme that strikes you right off the bat with Jefferson. It wasn't terribly unusual for him to go to college at such a young age of 16, but he was, from the very beginning, kind of a polymath, kind of a student of languages, a student of music, a student of arts and science, and he was excellent at just about everything. To give you a famous quote about how smart he was, the quote is from John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had a dinner in the White House for a group of Nobel Science Prize winners, different sciences, physics, etc. And he started the dinner by saying to the 100 or so people there, "This is the smartest group of people sitting at the White House at one time since the last time that Thomas Jefferson dined alone," meaning Jefferson was smarter than all of you guys put together, which isn't quite true. It's a slight exaggeration. But he was famous for his intellect and for his interest in many different things. So his political career began early and lasted, obviously, most of his adult life. And I'm going to go into most of these in a little bit of depth. But he was a delegate to the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the state legislature. And he started that at a young age in his 20s. And then he went on to be a delegate to the Continental Congress, the governor of Virginia. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress after the United States declared independence and during the 80s. He served as a U.S. minister to France for about 5 years. And he was the Secretary of State, the first Secretary of State for the United States under George Washington. And then, of course, he was the president for 2 terms, from 1801 to 1809. And I'll talk about each of those just a little bit. So he served as a delegate in the Virginia House of Burgesses from 1769, so he would have been about 26, until 1775. So he was still a very young man in his 30s when the U.S. was fighting the War of Independence and declaring independence. Some interesting things about his time as a delegate in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Even though he was one of the wealthiest planters in Virginia and one of the largest slaveholders in Virginia, he pursued reforms that had to do with slavery. So, for example, he wanted legislation that would give slave owners power to emancipate their slaves, and it was hard for them to do that under colonial law at the time. They had to basically get the governor's permission or the legislature's permission to set free their own slaves. They couldn't do it voluntarily, and he wanted to get that freedom for them so that they could let their slaves go free if they wanted to. As a lawyer, while he was in the House, he also worked as a lawyer, And he took 7 cases on behalf of slaves who were suing for their freedom. In one case, he tried to argue natural law. In other words, he tried to argue to the court that all humans are born free, and therefore the slave that he represented was free, and his natural right to freedom should be recognized by the court, and he should be set free, which is the same principles that would later appear in the Declaration of Independence. The judge dismissed his argument, and he lost the case. Because obviously that would end all slavery in Virginia if they acknowledged that sort of thing. When Jefferson lost, he gave his client some money, and the client used that money to escape into freedom. Now, that's the opposite about how lawyer-client things work. Usually the client gives the lawyer money, not the other way around. So you see at least some interest, and the irony there is already present. He is the biggest slaveholder in Virginia, but he's already, at least in some ways, he appears to be anti-slavery. So he became involved in the movement for rebelling against British taxation and British policies in the 1770s. If you'll remember, the British passed the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts in 1775. They shut down the port of Boston. They closed the Massachusetts government. They passed a law saying that British soldiers accused of crimes could have their trials in London instead of where they committed the crime. All sorts of things that outraged Americans. Jefferson wrote a resolution in the Virginia House of Burgesses in response to this, calling for a day of fasting and prayer. And he later expanded this resolution into a whole essay on the rights of the American colonists. In response to his declaration or his resolution, the Virginia governor closed the House of Burgesses, and they ended up meeting secretly and meeting on their own and sort of continuing their work. But they ended in response to his resolution. He married once in 1770. Well, first of all, in 1768, he began constructing his famous house, Monticello. And you can still visit Monticello today. Of course, it's a famous historical landmark. They have tours. They have all sorts of historical and archaeological information there going on constantly. Kind of like the George Washington Mount Vernon site, where there's also lots of tours and lots of historical research going on there daily. Monticello, he named Monticello because it's Italian for something like Little Mountain or Little Hill. He taught himself Italian, by the way. He invited some Italian gardeners to come help him at Monticello and bought a book on Italian, and when they arrived, he could hold conversations with them because he had read the book. So he loved Monticello. He spent his whole life basically as an architect designing different aspects of it. It was built with local skilled labor, but also with the slave labor of his own slaves. In 1772, so he would have been about 29, he married this woman, Martha Dandridge, I think was her last name. And they had, Skelton, sorry. Her married name was Skelton because she was a widow. She was 23. They apparently had a very happy marriage. They were very much alike. She loved to read, just like he did. She loved music. She played the piano, and he accompanied her on violin. They had 6 children, but only 2 of those children survived to adulthood. The other 4 died either in infancy or early in childhood. His wife, Martha, died shortly after the birth of their last child, so she would have been, I think, 30 or so, early 30s when she died. And he was devastated and heartbroken and never married again. He was appointed a Virginia delegate to the Continental Congress and served there during the kind of crucial years of 1775 and 1776 when the Congress was declaring independence from Great Britain. And obviously, most famously, most notably, he was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. I've talked about that before, so I won't say much about it again, except he had become close friends with John Adams. They were totally different people. Adams was never a slave owner, was anti-slavery, was a small farmer. Adams was not nearly as as gifted a writer as Jefferson was. And even though the initial expectation was that on the Committee of Five, Adams would be the primary author of the Declaration, Adams insisted that his friend Jefferson should do the writing instead, and Jefferson was given that task and became the principal author. What I don't know if I mentioned is that when he submitted the draft, which was submitted on June 28, 1776, about a week before the Declaration was formally approved, the Congress as a whole met and revised the draft and cut about a fourth of it out. And Jefferson sat there and never said anything during the debates and the discussion, cutting out parts of his draft. But apparently he was enraged and believed to his dying day that they had mangled it and ruined it by all their cutting. And one of the most famous cuts that they made was to a lengthy passage where he criticized the slave trade and just laid into George III, the King of England, for permitting the slave trade. And this was controversial because, of course, it wasn't lost on any of the people there that Jefferson was the biggest slave owner of them all. And so it seemed weird that he was criticizing slavery and the slave trade when he was a beneficiary of it. But that was left out of the Declaration, that criticism of the slave trade. During the Revolution, Jefferson returned to the Virginia House of Delegates, to the Virginia legislature. And he had he also served for 2 terms as the governor of Virginia in 1779 and 1780. He had 2 or 3 strong concerns. Again, he was still wanting laws and statutes to, if not end slavery, at least reform slavery. He also wanted to do away with aristocracy and feudalism, and he attacked a couple of doctrines that I've mentioned to you before, primogeniture and entail. These were old English legal doctrines where the eldest son inherited the entire estate of his father and could not sell or divide that estate. It had to remain intact from generation to generation and in the hands of only the eldest son. And this was a key kind of legal construct of aristocracy. And so in the Virginia legislature, one of his primary goals was to do away with these laws and things like that. He also wrote and was very, very passionately in support of a bill for establishing religious freedom. And I'm going to talk about that bill at some length in a few minutes. It didn't get passed initially. During the Revolution, it did not pass. There was still a lot of sentiment in Virginia for keeping the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, the official Church of Virginia. But eventually his friend James Madison would kind of resuscitate his bill and would get it passed in 1786, while Jefferson was actually away in France, if I remember correctly. During this time, 1785, so this is just after the Revolution has ended, the United States is a new country, but there's no president yet, there's no constitution yet. This is during the Articles of Confederation period. A French diplomat wrote a letter to Jefferson. He actually wrote the letter in 1780 when the war was still going on, and he asked him for information about Virginia, just what's it like. And Jefferson wrote his most famous book, his only real book, I guess, called Notes in the State of Virginia. He spent 5 years studying the religion, the history, the geography, the agriculture of Virginia, and he wrote this sort of encyclopedic response to the French diplomat. And is famous for long passages about slavery, about politics, about you name it, everything under the sun. So it's considered one of the most important books written in America by an American in the 1700s. One of the things I guess I should say here, I probably ought to save it for the discussion specifically about slavery, but I'm afraid I'll forget if I don't say it now. He had something interesting and controversial to say about slavery. He made it clear that he thought it was immoral and should be ended, but he also did not think that blacks and whites could live together peacefully in the same state. He thought that once slavery ended, because of the antagonism and the hostility that slavery had created, that the result of freedom would be sort of a civil war between the black Virginians and the white Virginians. And therefore, the form of abolition of slavery that he always supported until his death was called colonization. He thought that the slaves of Virginia should be set free and then given some other colony to go move to somewhere else, either in the United States or in Africa or wherever it might be, because he was just completely pessimistic, cynical about the possibility that the two races could coexist peacefully. In Congress in the 1780s, when Jefferson represented Virginia, he became the principal author of the Land Ordinance of 1784, which set out what to do with the territories that the United States had acquired from Great Britain northwest of the Ohio River, in the west of the Appalachians. This was territory that had not been formed into states, and this was territory that the British ceded to the United States after 1783. He won one very important principle. He argued successfully that this territory did not belong to any of the 13 original states, and instead, a mechanism should be set up so that this territory could be divided into new states, and that's exactly what happened. The states became Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and so forth and so on. He did lose on another idea of his, which was probably even more important to him. He wanted a provision banning slavery in all new territories, all new states. This was called the Jefferson Proviso, and it was voted down by one vote. And so if he had succeeded, imagine how different American history would be. The only states where slavery was legal would have been the original states of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, those five. And the new states of Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas eventually. According to Jefferson, slavery should have been and would have been prevented in all of those states. This was voted down, like I said, but at least it became partially law in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which banned slavery in the Northwest territories, but not the Southwest ones. Now I want to talk for a minute about one of his most interesting and important accomplishments, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And I think maybe his most important, in my opinion. It's just my opinion. But I think the ideas he expresses here are profound and interesting. So he wrote this in 1777. He introduced it in the Virginia legislature in 1779, or it was introduced on his behalf. It was overlooked. It didn't pass until it was resurrected by James Madison and others in the 1780s. And it finally became law in Virginia in 1786. I want to talk about it at length because I want you to understand the principles in it. I think they're very important for understanding freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And Jefferson was famous as a champion of both of these ideas. So this is what Jefferson wrote. An act for establishing religious freedom, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burthens, or by civil incapacitations, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and therefore are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do. That the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time. He has a couple of really interesting concepts here. First of all, he says, now it was pretty much universal at that time that they all believed in God and that God created the world. So, and Jefferson seems to have believed that too. So, but he notices one very important thing right off the bat. He says, God created the human mind free. In other words, they all looked to the Bible, they all studied the same Bible basically, and in it, there's plenty of examples of humans rejecting God or not doing what they're told to do. And he says, okay, so God gave them freedom of the will. God gave them the freedom to follow or not follow him as they choose. Therefore, if we don't have freedom of religion, we're not following God's plan because his plan allows for freedom. And so that was an interesting idea. And then he has this interesting concept. He says, attempts to influence it by punishments and burdens only create hypocrisy and meanness. So if the Virginia government tries to force everybody to become Episcopalians, what will that do to the Baptists and Methodists, not to mention the Jews? They won't suddenly all say, okay, we agree, we're going to become Episcopalians. They will either become hypocrites, pretending to do so in order to not be punished, right? But that's not true religion. So you can't really force somebody to adopt your religion. All you can do is force them to pretend to. In other words, create hypocrisy. And that's not the right goal. And he says, another interesting idea, he says that the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others. So he says, all people are fallible. No person is perfect. So who are we going to put in charge of the religion in the state of Virginia? Whoever we pick, even if it's Thomas Jefferson, even if it's George Washington, who all of them loved, that person is not going to be perfect, is going to make mistakes. But if we give that person the power of the law, the power of the government, that person's mistakes are going to become the law. So we will have, by definition, a flawed religion that we're all forced to follow. Better to not force anybody to do anything, right? Rather than use the government to force people to follow something that is incorrect, is what he says. So there's some principles you see here. He doesn't want the government forcing people to behave like hypocrites. He doesn't want the government violating people's freedom of conscience, right? And he doesn't want the government having the kind of power that only a perfect being should have or could use correctly. He goes on, he says, our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions, any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. He doesn't think there's any rational reason why someone shouldn't be allowed to vote because of their religion. Right? We don't take people's power to vote away because of their opinions on physics or science. Why should we do it on their opinions of religion?
As long as they're a man.
Yes, not a woman. Right. He wasn't willing to go that far. Not yet. That to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. What does he mean here? If I'm an Episcopalian in Virginia and I force you by taxation to support my church against your will, that is sinful. That is tyrannical. That even the forcing him to support this or that teacher of his own religious persuasion is depriving him of the comfortable liberty of giving his contributions to the particular pastor whose morals he would make his pattern and whose powers he feels most persuasive to righteousness, and is withdrawing from the ministry those temporary rewards which, proceeding from an approbation of their personal conduct, are an additional incitement to earnest and unremitting labors for the instruction of mankind. He says here, if we tax people and take their money away from them to support a state church, that's money they could have used to support the church and the pastor that they do like. And this makes me remember one interesting thing. I'll just pose this as a question. When Virginia stopped taxing people to support churches and stopped forcing people to go to church, do you think church attendance in Virginia and church membership went up or down? The correct answer is up, right? Why? Because now they can go where they want to go. You see? And now they can spend their money to support churches that they actually like instead of one they don't like. And so it went up. There was actually a flowering of religion rather than a diminishment of it. I'm going to skip this one. Actually, the middle concept is good, that it tends only to corrupt the principles of that very religion it is meant to encourage. This is a widely held view by Jefferson and others, that when a government had a state religion, again, the Church of England in this case, it didn't just corrupt the government, it also corrupted the religion. That having the two together made both of them suffer. Now, this last paragraph is, I think, the most interesting part of the whole statute, because it's applicable to everything, not just religion, but freedom of speech in general. He says, and finally, that truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and has nothing to fear from the conflict, unless by human interposition, disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, error ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. This, I think, is the most brilliant insight Jefferson has, but maybe the trickiest. So suppose you have two guys back then, one is an Episcopalian and one is a Baptist, and hey, maybe one of them is an atheist. That almost didn't happen back in those days, but it was possible. And each of them says, my religion is the true. This guy says, my religion is the true religion, and yours are false. But then, and Jefferson would have said, okay, fine, that's your opinion, you're entitled to it, no big deal. But now he wants to go a step further, and he says, I want to use the power of the government of Virginia to prohibit you from spreading these false ideas. All right? Now Jefferson said, well, wait a minute. If your religion is true and these are false, don't you think that the truth of your religion can stand all by itself? All right? Are you so afraid of these false ideas that you think your true one will lose in a debate against them? If it will lose in a debate against them, it must not really be true. And if it could win in a free debate against them, then what do you need the government for? Just have the debate and let it win, and the true religion will rise to the surface. And this is true of any idea, not just religion. It's true of politics. It's true of science. It's true of, if you think someone else has a terrible idea, well, let them say it. And if it really is terrible, all the people who hear it will recognize how terrible it is, and they'll gravitate towards the true idea. That was Jefferson's belief. And that's why Jefferson believed in freedom of religion, freedom of speech, etc., rather than using government to try to censor bad religions and bad ideas. So, be it enacted by General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions and matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. Notice there are no limitations on this whatsoever, right? You are free to have any religion you want or none at all. according to Jefferson. You can be a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, an atheist, and the government will not punish you in any way, is the idea here. Okay, so that was his maybe his most famous accomplishment. Now I want to briefly remind you about Jefferson's time as Secretary of State in the Washington administration. I know I mentioned this the other day, but it's so important that a brief reminder is worthwhile. So Jefferson becomes the first Secretary of State under Washington, and he immediately goes head-to-head against Alexander Hamilton because they have different ideas about everything. Let me walk you through some of those different ideas. So the Federalists under Hamilton supported a strong national government, but the Republicans feared that a strong national government would threaten individual liberty and states' rights. So the Republicans, Jefferson's group, on the left, the Federalists, Washington, Hamilton, of course, is the ideological leader, and Adams. On the right, the Republicans are mostly Jefferson and Madison, and others, but those are the names you have to remember. For the Constitution, Federalists say the Constitution gave implied powers to the federal government, and the Constitution should be interpreted loosely in order to broaden those government powers. Jefferson and the Republicans say the Constitution gave to the federal government only those powers that were specifically enumerated. They want a strict interpretation. So if the Constitution doesn't say you can charter a bank, you can't do it, according to Jefferson. I didn't mention this the other day, but it's worth mentioning. The Federalists were not crazy about westward expansion. They preferred kind of focusing eastward, and they wanted to encourage manufacturing and population growth on the eastern cities like New York and Baltimore and Boston and so forth. The Republicans under Jefferson were excited about westward expansion. Jefferson had a vision of the whole North American continent, westward all the way to the Pacific, as what he called an empire of liberty. He wanted the United States to expand across that territory and for it to be incorporated into the United States and divided into states like what happened, like it is today. Federalists wanted an economy, and they tended towards government planning through subsidies and tariffs, things to guide the development of the economy. Republicans like Jefferson preferred a laissez-faire approach. This is the French term that meant let it go or leave it alone. What we would today consider a more libertarian idea of having very limited government taxation, government subsidies, very limited government involvement in the economy. Hamilton, I did mention this the other day, but a useful reminder, he wanted to create a national debt by having the U.S. government assume the state's Revolutionary War debts and raise taxes to pay them. Jefferson, he wasn't against paying off the debt, but he was much less excited about creating a national debt and raising taxes. Hamilton supported the creation of a national bank. Jefferson believed that it was unconstitutional. And Jefferson also believed that the bank would basically help Hamilton and his friends. His friends were wealthy merchants in New York City, and those were the kinds of people who would benefit from a bank, not the farmers that were Jefferson's constituents. I talked about foreign policy a little bit, but again, it's very important. During Washington's administration, the French Revolution was happening, and it descended into chaos, terrorism, a bloodbath, and the Federalists were horrified by all that. The Republicans were much more pro-French and pro-revolution than the Federalists were. So, in 1796, you see really the first election in which there are two political parties. John Adams is the candidate for the Federalists. He had been Washington's vice president. And Thomas Jefferson is the candidate for the Republicans. And something interesting happens. Adams gets a slight majority. He wins 71 with 71 electoral votes. Jefferson comes in second place with 68 electoral votes. And because the Constitution was written in a different way, because the Constitution was written without any anticipation that there would be political parties and that the two primary vote getters would be enemies, the way it was originally written said that the person who gets the second highest number of votes will become vice president. So Adams was elected president and Thomas Jefferson was elected vice president, even though they were rivals and disagreed on almost everything. That would be, to give you an idea how strange it was and how terrible it was, kind of like having that system today. If we had that system today, Joe Biden would be our president and Donald Trump would be our vice president. And that would be a nightmare, right? Or 4 years ago, Trump would have been president and Hillary Clinton would have been vice president. You would have constant mistrust, constant suspicion of one another, and that's what you had during these 4 years. It made things worse because the Federalists were constantly thinking that Jefferson's supporters were going to hatch conspiracies to make him president, right? To get rid of them, to kind of have a coup or a revolution on their own. And it didn't help that the Republicans were always talking about how much they admired the French Revolution. Right? That didn't make the Federalists feel any more confident. So it led to distrust, it led to mutual suspicion for a number of years. The suspicion and the distrust got worse because of something called the XYZ affair. Now, the Jay Treaty had been signed during Washington, and it had been a treaty between the United States and Britain, and France had been offended by this and thought that we were violating our treaty with them. We had a treaty of alliance with them from 1778 during the American Revolution, and that alliance said, we will go to war with you. We will be your allies. You will be our allies. Well, the French said, this was around 1785, 95, 96. They were at war with Britain again, and they said, you're supposed to help us. You're on our side. And Washington said, no, we're neutral. And Hamilton actually had a nice quote. Hamilton said, our treaty of alliance was with your king. You chopped his head off, so the treaty is no good anymore. So the French began seizing American ships at sea, treating us as if we were their enemy, common enemy, along with Great Britain. And the British were doing the same thing, but that's a different story. So John Adams sent 3 diplomats to France to try to resolve the problem. When they got to France, the foreign minister, I don't remember his exact title, was a guy named Talleyrand, and he refused to even meet with them until they paid him a bribe. And they were outraged, and one of them said, we'll pay millions of dollars for war, but we won't pay a single cent for a bribe. So they came back to the United States. It became a huge controversy. Jefferson's Republicans were humiliated because of the perception that they were on France's side rather than ours, and it increased the distrust between the United States, within the United States, between the two parties. It also led to something called the quasi-war. We call it a quasi-war because there was no declaration of war, but for a couple of years during Adams' administration, the United States and France were basically at war at sea, right, attacking each other's ships, treating each other like enemies. So because Adams's Federalist Party was so suspicious of Jefferson and his followers, they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts had 4 different components. Some of them were just anti-immigrant. I'll explain them one by one. So the Alien Enemies Law said the president could detain or deport citizens of a country with whom the U.S. was at war. This was aimed at French people. There were a lot of French immigrants in the United States. So basically he said, if we declare war, the president can deport any French citizen at will. No trial, no due process, he can deport them. There was also an alien law, said the president could expel any foreigner by executive decree. These were never put into practice because war was never declared. There was a naturalization law. It created a 14-year probationary period before foreigners could become citizens. And the purpose of this law was basically to prevent Irish immigrants from voting, because they were voting for the Republicans. They were voting for Jefferson's party. Now, the last part is the most controversial. It's called the sedition law. The sedition law said, I have to word this properly, any criticism of the United States president or the United States Congress was criminal libel and was punishable by fines and imprisonment. Now, the law didn't say it was a crime to criticize the vice president, because that was Jefferson, so you're fine to criticize him. But if you criticized the president, you could go to jail. And about 10 Republican reporters, newspaper publishers, were actually fined and put in prison for violating this law. They wrote things about John Adams. They called him toothless. One of them called him a hermaphrodite. Stuff like that. And so they just put him in prison for doing this. Well, the Federalists were just as mean. They called Jefferson a rapist. Unfortunately, that one may have turned out to be true. So the sedition law, now right off the bat, when I say the sedition law, what part of the U.S. Constitution would that seem to violate? Freedom of speech. Here's the irony. A lot of the guys who voted for the sedition law in Congress were the same guys who ratified the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech. So did they not think there was a contradiction here? Did they not care because they just hated the Republicans so much? Who knows? But they seem to have been pretty clearly violating that guarantee, and yet they did it anyway. Jefferson and Madison wrote a couple of famous resolutions called the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, protesting these laws. Jefferson had they had a few basic points to make. Now, they said that the federal union, the United States, was a compact or a contract. They said that the states transferred certain explicit powers to the national government, but they retained full authority over all matters the Constitution did not specifically mention. Now, follow these concepts. It's a contract between the states. The states create the national government. They transfer some powers to that government, but not all. And so then they mention the powers that were transferred. The Constitution gave the federal government power to punish treason, counterfeit money, piracy, felonies, offenses against the law of the United States. Does it say anywhere in the Constitution that the federal government, the Congress, has the power to punish libel, sedition? So remember, Jefferson has a very strict reading of the Constitution. He's saying the states, he's not just saying it violates the First Amendment. He's saying the states never gave you the power to punish libel, to punish slander, to punish sedition, to punish speech. They never gave you that power in the first place. Therefore, it's unconstitutional because it violates the 10th Amendment. Congress doesn't have this power to begin with. He doesn't even get into the First Amendment. So, if it is sedition to criticize the president, who has the power to punish it? The states, not the federal government, not Congress. That's Jefferson's reasoning and Madison's reasoning in these resolutions. So nothing ever happened. The Sedition Act was never declared unconstitutional. Most people today think it should have been, but it was never declared unconstitutional. The 10 guys who got sent to jail stayed there for a long time. They were eventually set free, pardoned when Jefferson became president in 1801. But we have another interesting election, and I'll close with this one. So in the election of 1800, it's a rematch between Jefferson and Adams. This time, Jefferson gets 73 electoral votes and Adams only gets 65. But there's another problem. Another thing that the original framers of the Constitution didn't anticipate. Jefferson was the presidential candidate, and Aaron Burr, was the vice presidential candidate. And they each got 73 votes, meaning they tied. How did that happen? Well, the way the Constitution was originally written, each of the electors in the Electoral College cast 2 votes. And the idea was, the expectation was, they'll vote for the 2 people they admire most in this world, and whoever gets the most such votes will become president, and whoever is the second most admired man in America, because it had to be a man in those days, will become vice president, and they'll work happily together for the benefit of us all. Now, people realize, wait a second, if everybody votes for Jefferson and then everybody casts their second vote for Burr, they'll tie, but everybody knows Burr is supposed to be vice president, right? So how do we avoid that? Well, the Republicans had a plan. They told one guy, don't vote for Burr, okay? Throw your vote away. Vote for Jefferson, but for your second vote, vote for Mickey Mouse, whoever it is, vote for somebody else, so that there's no tie, and so Jefferson will be president, Burr will be vice president, like we intend. Well, Alexander Hamilton came along and messed it up. Actually, wait, no. He messed up something different. I'll get into a different one. That was a different election, sorry. So he actually fixes it. So the guy who was supposed to not vote for Burr forgot his job. He only had one job. And he forgot that job. And he voted for Burr. I guess he got so excited. And so they tied. And then people came to Burr and they said, hey, you should announce that you don't want to be president. You knew all along you were supposed to be vice president. And Burr was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so the House of Representatives didn't know what to do. According to the rules, the House of Representatives has to break the tie. Now, to make it more complicated, the House of Representatives was Federalist. It was dominated by the Federalists, and the Federalists were led by Hamilton. So to try to think of this like today, imagine that Trump loses the last election, but he gets to decide who's going to be president, right? Because he controls the party that's controlling Congress. That's what happened. The Federalists lost the election, but Hamilton controls Congress, and he gets to pick which one of these 2 is going to become president. And the Federalists agonize over it, and they actually vote over and over, and they can't decide. And finally, Hamilton reaches a decision, and he breaks the tie. He knows both of them. He thinks Jefferson is a man of honesty and principle who's just wrong on everything. And he says, but at least we can trust him, right? He says what he thinks. He's wrong on everything, but he says what he thinks. Burr has no principles whatsoever. He's a liar, and so we can't trust him at all. Let's go with the guy who we trust to be wrong rather than the guy who has no principles at all. And so that's how Jefferson became president. All right, that's where we'll stop for today. Okay, there we go. So last time I mentioned the events leading up to the election of 1800, how it was one of the most controversial elections in American history, finally decided by the House of Representatives in favor of Jefferson, and he becomes president. And remember, Republicans had been put in jail, 10 of them or so, for criticizing President Adams under the Sedition Act. And Jefferson takes office then in 1801 with all of that behind him. And in his inaugural address, he talks about many things. One of the most interesting things he talks about is the idea of freedom of speech. So he says, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety, with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. So he's repudiating the Sedition Act. He's saying we're not going to put people in jail for having contrary political opinions, even if they wish to destroy the republic. Or as long as that's what they say, then we'll just let them say it, because we will be free to give our opinions in response. Our opinions will prevail over theirs. This is similar to the ideas he expressed in the statute on religious freedom that he wrote for Virginia several years earlier. And notice he also points out every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. He's basically saying, in today's language, he would say we're all Republicans, we're all Democrats. So the differences that divide us are not the kinds of differences that we should be putting each other in prison over or oppressing each other over. So his presidency lasted 8 years. And I want to start with just an overview of some of his policies and accomplishments. So first, he revised or ended several Federalist policies. He repealed the excise tax on whiskey. Remember, that had sparked the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania in the early 1790s. He abolished all internal taxes, leaving only land sales and customs duties for raising federal revenue. He also cut government spending and cut the national debt in half. And as part of that, he cut spending on the military. So right away, you see a huge aspect of Jefferson and presidents like him that would continue down the road for many years: low taxes, low spending, and even low military spending. He did establish West Point in 1802. So he wasn't entirely anti-military. He just wanted to limit military spending. He repealed the Naturalization Act, which had established a 14-year waiting period for becoming citizens. This moved it back to the 5-year period that it had been before. He allowed the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire, and he pardoned people who were still in prison under the Sedition Act. He did continue to enforce some Federalist policies. He continued paying the national debt. He could have, I guess, defaulted on the debt because he was opposed to it, but that would have been terrible for the nation's credit and financial stability. So he continued paying the national debt. He also permitted the Bank of the United States to continue operating undisturbed. Remember, he thought it was unconstitutional, and he had opposed it, but since it had already been created and was now law, he allowed it to continue operating. He also reaffirmed George Washington's policy of isolationism from his farewell address. He said in his inaugural address that the United States would seek peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. And that phrase, entangling alliances, became famous for American isolationism. And you could argue that today we have many entangling alliances. We have treaties with NATO countries, with Asian countries that obligate us to go to war if those countries are attacked. Jefferson, like Washington, opposed those entangling alliances that he called them. I want to talk a little bit about one of the most important accomplishments of the Jefferson presidency, and that was the Louisiana Purchase. So to start, you can see the Louisiana Purchase in green here on the map, and you can see the Mississippi River there on the eastern border of what was the huge Louisiana Territory. Well, the Mississippi River was very important to the economy of the United States. Western farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains, so that's everybody in here, this huge chunk of territory, they depended upon the Mississippi River to get their goods to markets. In other words, it was much cheaper to transport by river their corn, wheat, whatever else they were growing to the Mississippi River, and then float it down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and then ship it back around to the eastern cities like Boston and New York. It was much cheaper to transport their products that way than to try to carry them over the Appalachian Mountains, which was slower and more expensive. So these farmers were dependent upon access to the Mississippi River. And then a crisis happened. In 1800, Spain returned the Louisiana Territory to France. It had been given to Spain after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. And by 1802, Americans were no longer being allowed to transfer their cargoes to boats in New Orleans. They were cut off from using the port. This could have created war because this was a direct threat, like I said, to the economy of the United States. So Jefferson sent diplomats to France, and they offered to purchase New Orleans. And they offered 15, wait, how much did they offer? I can't remember how much. I think they wanted to offer 5 million. What did you say?
I think what the Louisiana purchase was like 15.
Yes, the Louisiana purchase was 15. You're absolutely right. But initially, all they wanted was New Orleans, and I think they wanted to offer 5 million, maybe 10, something in that range. But when they got there, they were surprised to discover that Napoleon had no interest in any of this territory, and he wanted to sell all of it, New Orleans and every bit of this huge chunk of land that you see, and he wanted $15 million for it, which is nothing. Obviously, it's nothing today for that huge chunk of land. Even in those days, that was a huge bargain. Basically, it was about 3 cents an acre. And to give you some perspective, the $15 million that he wanted would be about $233 million today, which is still nothing, because the land itself, just the land, let alone any minerals underneath it or anything like that, would be, at least $1 trillion today. So this was the greatest land deal in history, perhaps, probably. So he offered to sell it because he was basically at war with England, and he was going to be at war with England for the next 10 or 12 years, and he was desperate for cash. And he also thought, this land isn't helping us at all, it's just empty. Well, empty of French people, basically. It's full of Indians, but so why not get some cash unloaded on the Americans? So the diplomats were excited. Jefferson was excited. He had one problem, and that was the Constitution. Remember, he had said all along that the Constitution should be strictly interpreted to only give the president or Congress powers that are explicitly, specifically authorized. Now, for him, unfortunately, he realized the Constitution doesn't say the president or the federal government or Congress, it doesn't say that they're authorized to buy land. And so he thought, I wonder if I'm being a hypocrite here. And he suggested amending the Constitution to make it clear that the Congress could buy land. But there wasn't time for that. Napoleon was in a hurry. He wanted his money. The deal was going to fall apart if they didn't act soon. James Madison was the Secretary of State, and he argued, probably rightly, I think, that the authority to buy land was implicit in the authority to make treaties and ratify them. Remember, Hamilton was the one who said there are implicit powers, not Jefferson. So Jefferson became a little bit Hamiltonian for this, and he said, okay, Madison, you're right. They rushed through the treaty, they bought the land, and by December 1803, Louisiana was a part of the United States. It was officially American territory. So what comes next is exploring this new land, because it hasn't really been mapped. There have been French traders, a few of them around it, but it's obviously mostly inhabited by Indians and mostly unknown to Americans or Europeans. Now, Jefferson actually planned the exploration before the Louisiana Purchase even happened. In January of 1803, he asked Congress for $2,500 to explore what would become the Louisiana Territory. And I think what was in his mind was, if there's a war, we will just take it. And he wanted to prepare for that possibility. That's just my educated guess. But then the Louisiana Purchase happened. By the end of 1803, it was no longer French territory. France had sold it to the United States. So he sends in 1804 Meriwether Lewis, who you can see there on the right, and William Clark, and he sends them to explore and to investigate this question, whether or not the Missouri River, so the Missouri River kind of branches off west across the North American continent from the Mississippi River, whether the Missouri River may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce. What he's referring to was the idea that we call the Northwest Passage. All the way back to the 1500s, explorers had been interested in the possibility that there was a water passage across the North American continent, that you could go by river from the Gulf of Mexico or even the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And they were excited about this possibility because they wanted an easy transportation route to the Pacific Ocean and then to China and India for trading purposes. And so Jefferson was hoping he was still hoping that would be found. And of course it wouldn't. There were Rocky Mountains in the way. There was no river going all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But he sent them to look for it. So they were gone for 2.5 years. And in addition to exploring this Northwest Passage question, they had 3 real purposes to their expedition. He wanted them to stake a claim to the Louisiana Territory and to the western part of the continent for the United States. He knew that Spain had claims to this land, and he wanted them to explore it and to map it so that America could say, we got there first, so it's ours. In addition to whatever they had paid to Louisiana, they wanted to have that we got there first claim. He also wanted them to engage in diplomacy with Indian tribes. So they carried with them these medallions, and they gave these medallions to the Indian tribes that they met along the way. And many of the tribes accepted them and treasured them and kept them for 50 or 60 years. It seems like the Indian tribes and Lewis and Clark meant different things by the medallions. In Jefferson's eyes, perhaps, when the Indians accepted the medallions, they were accepting American sovereignty over them. They were acknowledging that the president, Jefferson, whose face was on the medallion, was their president too. And the Indians' point of view, no, they were just accepting this as a token of friendship and alliance between two peoples. The third reason was scientific exploration and discovery. Jefferson gave them detailed instructions. He gave them basically many courses, many lectures on botany and biology, and he asked them to take detailed drawings, to collect specimens, and they did. They came back with hundreds, maybe thousands of drawings of animal life and plant life, specimens of animal life and plant life. So this was like a big chance to discover the North American continent's flora and fauna. And that was another motive for the trip. While they were gone, or around the time they were gone, one of the most interesting scandals, controversies in American history took place. And it's not directly relevant to a lot of stuff, you know, the strategies and the international crises of the Jefferson presidency, but it's so interesting that it really has to be talked about. And some of you watched the Hamilton video, and it talks about this a little bit in that one as well. If you're interested in the topic, there's an hour-long documentary on YouTube just about the Hamilton-Burr duel, and it is awesome. It is just really, really fascinating. So the story here is, remember, Hamilton was a Federalist, and he lived in New York, and there was a group called the Essex Junto. Why they called themselves that, I don't know. But this was a group of angry Federalists, not Hamilton, but other angry Federalists in New York and in New England, who were upset about Jefferson's victory in 1800 and his assumption of the presidency. And they didn't like the way the country was going. And so they wanted the northeastern part of the United States to secede from the Union. They wanted New York and everything northeast of it, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, to just separate off and become a different country. And as part of their plot, they recruited Aaron Burr to run for governor of New York in 1804 as a Federalist. Remember, he had been a Democrat. He had been on Jefferson's party, and he had actually been Jefferson's vice president. Well, they recruited him to run as a Federalist, but Hamilton hated him, didn't trust him, knew that Burr was a person of no moral principles, and he did not want Burr representing the Federalist Party. And Hamilton didn't want any part of this talk of secession either. He wasn't interested in any of that. So Hamilton opposed the Essex junta, and he opposed Aaron Burr, and he basically defeated Aaron Burr's candidacy in 1804. And over the course of that campaign, they wrote nasty stuff about each other. They accused each other of everything under the sun. And it got to the point where Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. Now, to understand duels back then, an important thing to understand is they were very common. This was a period in American life where lots of gentlemen supposedly fought duels to settle their differences, but they had kind of a strict code of etiquette that went along with the dueling. You weren't just supposed to grab your gun and kill the guy. That was not polite. There was a process where you were supposed to challenge, and then the other person could apologize for whatever they had done wrong, and then the challenge would be satisfied, and you wouldn't have to duel. Or you could have intermediaries try to work out like a negotiated compromise where you apologize a little bit, but not too much. But most of the challenges to duels never actually ended up with guys shooting each other. Usually they were resolved with some sort of apology or something long before the shooting ever took place. But in this case, neither guy was willing to back down. They were not willing to retract any of the statements they had made about each other. And so they actually showed up on the day of the duel in the summer of 1804. Now, the second part of dueling that you need to understand is the important part of the duel for proving your manhood, your courage, was showing up. But a lot of the duelists didn't actually try to kill the other guy. So it was common to show up and then shoot your pistol into the ground, or even resolve things on that day. And it was like, okay, we're both here. We don't really want to kill each other. Let's just shake hands and go home. Now we're satisfied. Nobody was a chicken, right? But, so they show up, they pick their pistols, they do the thing where they march a certain set of feet away from each other, whether it was 30 feet or what. This looks like it's about 20 or 30 feet, something like that. And then the okay was given to fire. And Hamilton, and this is where there's controversy over 200 years later, trying to figure out exactly what happened. What we know is Hamilton fired his gun into the air. Now, what did that mean? There are those who think, and I'm one of them, that Hamilton was deliberately wasting his shot. In other words, he was purposefully not shooting Burr, and this was his part of the code. He was saying, I'm here, I'm going to fire my shot, but I don't really want to kill you, so I'm just going to shoot harmlessly into the air. And to strengthen that claim, we know that he wrote a letter to somebody. I don't remember if it was his daughter or a friend. He wrote a letter just a day or two before this saying, I don't want to kill Burr. But he did want to go through with the duel. He didn't want to back down or apologize. Well, Burr wanted to kill Hamilton. So Hamilton shot his shot into the air, and then Burr took very careful aim, shot Hamilton in the stomach, and Hamilton died in agony several hours later. Burr was accused of murder because dueling was illegal in the state of New York, and they had crossed over into New Jersey, but New York still wanted to prosecute Burr for the murder. So Burr fled the country. He actually moved to, he didn't flee the country exactly. He fled the state. He went to Louisiana, so it was now an American territory, but he hoped to escape from New York jurisdiction and not go on trial. And to make a long story shorter, Burr was eventually arrested in Louisiana, not for killing Hamilton, but for plotting with an American general in Louisiana to go to Texas, invade Texas, steal it from Spain, and then make Burr the emperor of Texas. And because this violated all sorts of treaties that the United States had with Spain, He was arrested. The general turned out to be a spy and informed on Burr. Burr was brought back to the United States. He was tried but acquitted. I guess there wasn't enough evidence against him. I haven't looked at the trial very carefully. And he lived the next 20 years of his life as basically an outcast. Right? His political career was wounded for killing Burr, killing Hamilton, and then allegedly committing treason against the United States. So all of that was going on. In the meantime, other things were happening in Jefferson's presidency. One thing that he had wanted to do for many years was abolish the slave trade. Now, the Constitution, as originally written, had said that Congress could not abolish the slave trade for 20 years. Well, in 1807, that 20-year period was up, and so at Jefferson's urging, Congress passed a law in December of 1806 banning the slave trade, the international slave trade. You could still buy and sell slaves inside the United States. It banned the international slave trade. It was signed by Jefferson in 1807, and it officially took effect on January 1, 1808. So the importation of slaves was now outlawed. In 1807, it was also outlawed by Great Britain. And it just pops into my head as an aside, Great Britain and other European countries, but mostly Great Britain, would then go on to try to stamp out the international slave trade. They actually fought multiple wars in Africa and around the world, stamping out the slave trade after they banned it in 1807. So there's a movie, controversial movie that came out a little while ago. Is it called The Woman King? Have you all seen it? No? Well, it gets the history backwards. And the history, it's around the 1840s, 1850s. There's a Dahomey tribe in Africa that is trying to end the slave trade, apparently, and fighting wars to end it, if I've heard correctly. And the reality was the Dahomey Kingdom was pro-slave trade, and they were fighting wars against Europeans who were trying to stamp out the slave trade by the 1850s. So it was kind of interesting. I haven't seen it, but that's my understanding from what people have told me. Now, this is the crisis that really undid the Jefferson presidency in many ways, especially the second term. So, France and England were at war from about 1803 to 1850. Napoleon was in charge of France. He was the emperor, the dictator by now. And so the wars were off and on between him and Great Britain. The U.S. was caught in the middle. Neither side wanted the United States to trade with the other side. So around 1806, Britain forbade neutral trade with the European continent. In other words, Britain said, if we catch you trading with France, we will seize your ship and all the goods on it and confiscate them. France retaliated by saying the same thing. All our ports are closed to British trade. If we catch anybody trying to trade with Britain, we will seize their products, etc., etc. Now, the British had the greatest navy in the world, so really they were the ones enforcing this embargo. And they ended up seizing dozens, maybe hundreds of American ships. And they also did something that infuriated Americans. They impressed about 9,000 American sailors. Now, what I mean by impressment is this. The British would board an American ship by force, right? They would say, if you don't let us on board, we're going to destroy you. And they would look for who they thought were British deserters. They would grab some American sailors on board the ship, and they would basically kidnap them and take them back to the British ship and make them serve in the British Navy against their will. Now, there was a little bit of a legal dispute about this. They would claim that these were deserters from the British Navy and that they were just capturing deserters. In reality, it looks like they were short of sailors and they just grabbed anyone they could and just kidnapped them. There was, like I said, a little bit of a legal dispute. When it came to a British deserter, if they caught someone with a British accent, they would claim this is a British person. He is subject to the king. He must serve on our ships. He has no choice in the matter. Americans would say, though, well, maybe he did have a British accent. Maybe once upon a time he did serve in the British Navy, but it's a new country now. And people can immigrate here if they want to, and they can become Americans if they want to, and so you have no right to take them. And the British never agreed with the American point of view on this. The painting on the right shows a notorious incident that almost led to war between the two countries in 1807. So the British ship is the Leopard, it's on the left. The American ship is the Chesapeake on the right. They were just offshore of Virginia. So people on the Virginia coast watched this unfold. The British ship stopped the American ship and ordered it to let the British go on board and look for deserters. The American ship refused, and the British opened fire. And the American ship ended up having to surrender. The British did board, and they took about 4 sailors. And they killed about 3 sailors in the fighting. The Americans were so outraged that, like I said, there were cries for war. But Jefferson and Madison, who was the Secretary of State, they chose another path. They avoided war. What they did instead was the Embargo Act. And most historians, I think, would say that this backfired. What they did was they passed a law forbidding American ships to sail to foreign countries and prohibiting all exports to foreign countries. Jefferson's rationale was, by trying to trade with Britain and France, we're in the middle of this war, and we're going to get sucked into the war if we keep trying to trade with them. So I'm going to ban all trade. We just won't have any foreign trade, and that'll keep us out of the war. It didn't work because there were so many American merchants and sailors who depended on foreign trade for their livelihood. They just started ignoring the embargo and smuggling and trying to trade illegally. And if they couldn't do it by getting ships out to sea through American ports, they traded illegally with Canada, which was, right next door. So most historians would say this policy failed because Americans just turned to smuggling. It hurt the American economy. Those who couldn't continue trade by smuggling were out of jobs. It did not change British or French behavior. Jefferson was hoping that they would back down in response to the embargo and say, okay, we respect your rights as a neutral country to trade with whoever you want, but neither one of them was willing to do that. Now I'm going to skip to after his presidency. The embargo situation was never resolved during Jefferson's presidency. Madison inherited that problem, and it eventually led to the War of 1812, but I'll talk about that later. Jefferson left office in 1809, but there's still a few interesting things to talk about before I leave Jefferson. One of his more significant accomplishments of his life was the foundation of the University of Virginia. It was Jefferson's idea. He organized the campaign for its charter. He purchased or organized the purchase of the location for the university. He designed the buildings and the curriculum. And he even, if I remember correctly, served as the rector or president of the university when it was first created. So this was a major ambition of his. And he wanted it to be a state university, not a private university. He didn't put a church in the middle of the campus. I'm sure they have chapels there now. But most universities back then were private, Harvard, Yale, and these were church-oriented universities. He wanted this to be secular. So at the center of the campus, there was a library rather than a church. Another interesting thing about his years after the presidency Remember, by 1800, Jefferson and Adams were bitter enemies. They were accusing each other of all sorts of horrible stuff, of being tyrants and revolutionaries and rapists and hermaphrodites and all kinds of crazy stuff. But they had been best friends. Back when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were very close, even though they were very different. And after Adams left office and Jefferson became president, they didn't speak to each other for about almost 12 years. People tried to organize a reconciliation between the two. Adams's wife, Abigail, you can see here, she urged Adams to reach out to Jefferson in 1804 and try to reconcile with him, but he wasn't ready to. A mutual friend of theirs named Benjamin Rush, who is a signer of the Declaration of Independence, he tried to talk the two of them into reconciling, but they weren't ready to. Finally, in 1812, Adams sent Jefferson a note or a card wishing him a Happy New Year. And that sparked a renewal of their friendship. They ended up exchanging about 158 letters over the next 14 years. And these letters are considered fascinating by historians. They reminisced about the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence. They debated stuff, but they just talked a lot about politics and history and the things that they had done together. And I don't know if they ever physically saw each other again, but by the time they died, they were, in a sense, best friends again through their letters. And now comes, I think, maybe the most interesting part. Whether coincidence or not, I don't know how to explain it, but they both died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing and publication of the Declaration of Independence. So it's interesting that they both died on the 50th anniversary. It's interesting that they both died on the same day. When Adams died, his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson lives." So he was thinking of his friend at that moment. What he didn't know was that Jefferson had already died in Virginia just a few hours earlier. So last, I want to talk about Jefferson's legacy just a little bit, because the other day I started with that. It's obviously very controversial. Jefferson has been memorialized with buildings, sculpture, postmarks, postage, currency. He was put on Mount Rushmore in the 1920s alongside Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. The Jefferson Memorial that you see on the picture on the left was dedicated in 1943, which was the 200th anniversary of his birth. It includes a 19-foot statue of Jefferson, and engraved on the walls are sayings, passages from his writings. We even have him on the $2 bill. You can see there in the upper right-hand corner. But Jefferson had a controversial relationship with slavery, and that has had many people question whether or not there should be memorials to him, whether or not there should be statues to him, and so forth. So during his lifetime, Jefferson owned over 600 slaves. Not all at once, but spread out over the course of his lifetime. They were either working in his household, they were on his plantations. He only freed 2 of those slaves while he was alive, and 7 others after he died, through his will or some other legal mechanism. However, despite owning so many slaves and setting so few of them free, he consistently spoke out against the international slave trade. He outlawed it when he was president, and he often advocated the gradual emancipation of slaves in the United States and the colonization of those slaves elsewhere. In 1776, remember when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wanted to include in it this condemnation of the slave trade. He wrote, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce." So this was cut out of the Declaration of Independence, but he wanted this condemnation of the slave trade to be in it. Remember I mentioned a book he wrote, Notes on the State of Virginia? This is a passage from that book. He says, "And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." What does he mean? He means he thinks that Virginia has offended God by practicing slavery while pretending to profess the equality of humankind. So in 1778, he supported a ban on slave importation in Virginia, meaning this was one of the first states in the world to ban the importation of slaves. In 1784, I think I mentioned this already, but it's worth mentioning again, he proposed a federal law banning slavery in new territories. And this law failed to pass by one vote. But a version of it was later written into the legislation establishing the Northwest Territory, which is why slavery was always illegal in the northwestern states like Ohio, Michigan, etc. Now, further complicating the controversy about Jefferson and slavery is that even during his lifetime, there were rumors that he had a affair with his own slave, Sally Hemings. And to make things weirder, you might not know this part, Sally Hemings was the half sister of his wife, his deceased wife. And she was only about 1/4, 1/8 black. The reports from people who saw her and knew her was that she actually looked like his deceased wife, which may have played some role in him falling in love with her or whatever he did. So we now think, according to DNA evidence that we have and other oral history and circumstantial evidence, that Jefferson had at least 6 children with Sally Hemings, and 4 of those survived to adulthood. We think he started his relationship with her when she joined him in Paris while he was the U.S. diplomat to Paris. She was only 14 at the time, but became pregnant with their first child by the time she was 16. An interesting wrinkle about all of this is that in Paris, slavery was illegal. Sally Hemings could have stayed there if she had wanted to and not come back with Jefferson to the United States. He had no legal power to force her to come back with him. One historian thinks that she made an agreement with him, that she would come back and live with him until he died, they died, but all of their children would be set free. And if that was the agreement, he lived up to it. He said what he did was he allowed 2 of them to escape, but everybody knew he wasn't really trying to catch them. They just left. And he set free the other 2 of the 4 surviving in his will. So they were all allowed to go. Now, in 1824, so this is just 2 years before Jefferson died, Jefferson proposed a national plan to end slavery by having the federal government purchase slave children for $12.50 apiece, raise them and train them in occupations, and then send them out of the country to Santo Domingo in the Caribbean islands. This was always Jefferson's idea of how to end the problem. I told you in the last class, he didn't think that you could just set the slaves free. He thought that first they had to be trained in an occupation so they could support themselves. And then second, this is it's probably the strangest part to your ears, they had to be given some other place to live. And the reason why he thought that is in this letter, and I'll just quote the last part of it. He's talking about slavery with a guy named John Holmes. And he says here, we'll skip to the middle. I can say with conscious truth that there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach in any practicable way. The cessation of that kind of property, for so it is misnamed, is a bagatelle which would not cost me in a second thought, if in that way a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected. And gradually and with due sacrifices, I think it might be. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other. So he says he wants a general emancipation and expatriation. A general, he means entire. He wants all of them to be set free. And expatriated. To expatriate is to go live in another country. Why does he insist that they can't stay in Virginia, which is their country? He says in this analogy here, this image, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. The wolf is the slave. And he thinks if he just lets the slaves go, they will attack him and there will be civil war. And that's why he thinks they can't be allowed to stay. So, nowadays, like I've said, there is considerable controversy over how to remember Jefferson, if we should remember him at all. On the left, you see a statue of him at William and Mary in Virginia. This is where he went to school about almost 300 years ago. And the statue was defaced. People painted the hands red. You can't see them. Oh, yeah, you can see the red paint there, just a little bit. And they wrote slave owner nearby. In the center, you see a statue of him at the University of Virginia. And people threw paint on it as well. And on the sides of the statue, you can't see on this picture, but they wrote racist and rapist. On the right, you see a statue of Jefferson that used to be in the New York City Council chamber, but about a year ago they voted to remove it. And I don't remember what they voted to do with it. They just didn't want it in the chamber anymore. So that suggests you, these are just a few examples that there are a lot of people who think that because of his relationship with slavery, because he was a slave owner, he should not be memorialized like this in any way.